What is up, guys? This is an additional episode of the Master Data Mechanic course. We're going to address the key changes that you need to be aware of to make successful use of H2N 4.1. Alright, so the first key difference you'll notice is the authentication system has been overhauled. So you perhaps remember we had to go to config other, we then had to input the license key that was provided to us by H2N. That whole system has been removed in favor of a login system. When you fire up H2N for the first time, you'll be asked to log in. You'll get directed to the H2N website. You can log in there, which then returns you back to the H2N client. So no need for manual copying and pasting of license keys. You can log into the H2N software in the same way that you log into the H2N site. Now, while that might seem like good news, it's because they're preparing to start charging you for the software. In fact, you'll note when you install H2N 4.1, you get this message, trial is valid until a certain date. And now we have to return to the idea of paying a monthly subscription. At this stage, there is simply one subscription plan referred to as H2N Pro. This might change because H2N 3 did have a few different subscription options, whereas here we just have H2N Pro or the free trial. That's it. You can see currently $49 per month. Again, subject to change. Now, I can imagine this could be disappointing for some users who have been using H2N 4 for free all of this time. But of course, we knew this day was going to come. And there are a number of upgrades as well that they've created for H2N 4.1, as we'll go through. Because it's essentially a brand new version of H2N, version 4.1, it's not possible to update from within a H2N 4.0 version of the software. So previously we just had to updates and we could choose to update H2N. If your version is starting with 4.0 point something, you can't do this from within the client. What we actually have to do is we have to download a brand new installer. We have to install a fresh instance of H2N 4.1. And remember, keep in mind what you've learned earlier in the course as well. You probably want to create separate instances of this and keep fresh versions, etc. All of that still applies. Once we've installed H2N 4.1, of course, it's not going to have any of our configuration. In H2N 4.0.xyz, we're going to need to go into config and export config to file. Then in our freshly installed H2N 4.1, we then go to configuration and import config from file. And the reason why it's necessary is because some of these configuration files have been structurally altered. They perhaps have different extensions. So by first of all exporting the config, then re-importing it into H2N 4.1, it ensures that the format of the configuration files is appropriate for H2N 4.1. In other words, you probably can't drag and drop your config. You need to make use of the inbuilt import config from file. Now, I say everything should work, but what users have found so far is that not everything does work. So for a start, if you go to config databases, you may find that you can't actually load up your pre-existing databases. It acts like it's switching, but then it just hangs. Now, it's unclear whether this is something that is going to be fixed. Hopefully it will. However, there is a fairly straightforward workaround, which is to export your hand histories from the last version of H2N 4.0, export them to a directory, then re-import them into H2N 4.1. The other thing that you can do if you followed instructions earlier in the course, all of your hand histories will be archived to a folder somewhere, probably one that's being uploaded to the cloud. So all you need to do is re-import your hand histories, create a fresh database, everything's going to work. The other thing you'll notice in config auto import is that this specific configuration doesn't seem to transfer when we import config. So first of all, our H2N archive folder is not set up. So if you were previously backing up your hand histories to a folder that's being uploaded to the cloud, you need to specify that folder location again. Also, you've lost all of your auto import information here. We need to link this to the hand history folder of every poker client that we play on. I haven't tested this yet, but I really wouldn't be surprised if layout of HUD panels wasn't conserved either. In other words, you may need to rearrange your HUD layout. So you can imagine there's probably other aspects that need reconfiguring because the config didn't transfer into the new version of H2N 4.1. Now, something else that's changed, and it's unclear at this stage whether this is intentional. When we go to config game types, the whole point of this is we were going to select which HUD and pop-ups we associate with each of the game types in the list. So here in this section in H2N 4.0, there was a simple drop-down box that allowed you to select the HUD and pop-ups you want to associate with this game type. mysteriously not present here. It might just be the case that Hand2Note is so fast now at building stats for HUDs and pop-ups that we're simply supposed to select this afterwards. So for example, in the stats tab, if I select a player, if I decide I want to rebuild for a different pop-up system, I can simply select that from the list, and it's going to rebuild those stats very quickly. Now, selecting HUD and pop-ups in game types did control what would pop up in the main window of Hand2Note 3 when we double-clicked on a player from the main window. But notice that Hand2Note 4 doesn't actually have a main window with a list of players in the same way that Hand2Note 3 had. What we do in Hand2Note 4 is we go to the Statistics tab and click on a player to switch, but that Statistics tab also has the ability to select a pop-up that we're building for. Game types is just purely to define the different game types rather than which pop-up and HUD is associated with that game type. Now, when we head into Stat Editor, we find a new feature, although this is not exclusive to Hand2Note 4.1. This was definitely released in some of the Hand2Note 4.0 versions. Badges are now an option in Hand2Note. A badge is going to be based on an expression string. We're going to talk about that a little bit later in the course, but there is something that I want to point out. First of all, Hand2Note have added an expression builder. So this is a graphical interface for building expressions. Players didn't necessarily like to deal with the basically scripting language of writing expression string. It was a little bit too technical for the average player to really get to grips with, whereas now it's possible to actually just use an expression builder. And then you can actually have a look at the expression string that's being generated as a result and potentially make any tweaks if you want to. Now, the thing that many users experienced is that some of their expression strings just weren't working, and they were getting the result from Hand2Note that their expression string was invalid, even though it was clearly not invalid according to the syntax. So here we get the information on how expression stats work, and we get some available functions here. For example, we found that the ops function just didn't seem to be working, and the cases function just didn't seem to be working, and it was producing incorrect expression strings according to Hand2Note, even though we're following the syntax perfectly. What we've realized by making use of the expression builder is that the syntax has evidently changed. So here, for example, we have riverbet is bluff, value larger than 35, smaller than 100. And then we have riverbet is bluff, and we can select sample, but that's not actually one of the available methods according to the documentation. Then when we have a look at the expression string, we're making use of this function with the name sample. But hold on a moment. Where exactly is that sample function according to the documentation? It's not here. In other words, it appears Hand2Note have changed the syntax and just not told anyone. And it may just be because they think, well, we've included an expression builder now anyway, so players will use that. And no one actually ever used this anyway, right? So we don't need to let players know that we've changed the syntax for this. Of course, players did use this. It's a breaking change for some of these expression stats because the syntax has been fundamentally changed. Now, we don't know what the new syntax is yet. At least I'm not aware of any documentation. However, we can figure it out by making use of the expression builder. So if you start by making use of the expression builder and then checking out the expression string that's generated, obviously we can slowly expose the different functions that are going to be available for use in expression strings. So we've learned a new function, it's sample, not in the documentation, but because we added that function here in the expression builder, we're now aware of its existence. And if we wanted to go back to using text-based expression strings, we're free to do that. We just need to make use of the new functions that are now available. Final feature is you'll notice that there is a databases tab now, and this is not the same as config databases. This is something completely separate. This is hand history mines for sale, and something that's very cool as well is an 11 million hand history database of what they're referring to as sky stakes cache. I guess that means nosebleeds. It's just completely free. In other words, if you have Hand2Note 4.1, you can just grab this 11 million hands data mine and run some population analysis. Want some mined data on mobile apps? 40 million hand database available for $49. And I'm sure the intention is to add more hand history mines as they become available. So very nice new feature for Hand2Note 4.1. In terms of can you continue to use Hand2Note 4.0 for free? I'm guessing for the time being, you'll be able to continue using that without having to pay a monthly subscription. But of course, there won't be any updates for Hand2Note 4.0. So eventually things are going to break, and Hand2Note developers are not going to release updates for that because they'll be working on the newer version, Hand2Note 4.1 onwards. you'll have to upgrade at some point to the newer version of Hand2Note 4.1. So overall, very positive upgrade for Hand2Note 4 with the version 4.1. And there are some other optimizations as well that we won't discuss. For example, I think under the hood, speed of hand history imports and stat building is even faster as a result of some changes that have been made in the code. But objective here was really just to cover the main changes in Hand2Note 4.1. And of course, many of the features we'll be talking about a little bit later in the Master Data Mechanic course, including how to create expression stats, create badges, and run population analysis, perhaps on one of these large hand history data mines that you've downloaded. Alright, thanks for checking out the content. Hope it was helpful. And if you did find the information helpful, remember that the rest of it is contained in the Master Data Mechanic course available from www.pokerweasel.com.